how do I keep learning every day so that I can get better and better? And that's the spirit that these leaders need to bring. And with that, I think hopefully every stakeholder they serve, every day they're spending in the community can make a small difference. And together, collectively, they and we can make a better India for 2047.
Hello and a warm welcome to a very special podcast series, Unusual Suspects. I am your host, Gaurav Choudhury. This is a series about unraveling stories of entrepreneurs, investors and businesses, professionals, and of course, philanthropists who are disruptors, yet not in your face. Their disruptions have consistently delivered on the purpose and the mission they've embarked on. Their values are as strong as the mission. Unusual Suspect streams on Earshot.in, Spotify.com, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, moneycontrol.com, and a host of other podcast streaming platforms and directories. Welcome to Season 5 of Catalyzing Change, the Power of Philanthropy, a podcast series by Money Control in collaboration with Giving Pie, India's first family-focused philanthropy network. Over 4 seasons, this series has examined the contours of Indian philanthropy from the personal to the institutional, from the individual act of giving to the architecture of change. We have heard from philanthropists working in health, education, gender equity, and everything in between. This season, we turn our gaze outward, but also inward. The Indian diaspora, now estimated to be about 34 million strong, is one of the most consequential communities in the global story of our time. Their economic and philanthropic footprints are well documented. But the Indian Philanthropy Report 2026 tells us that though its remittances have grown at 14% between 2021 and 2025, diaspora engagement today goes well beyond them. It encompasses knowledge transfer, advocacy, cross-border partnerships, and of course, their global networks. In several cases, it also encompasses leadership. This season of Catalyzing Change is about understanding this engagement and the people behind it. We are profiling Indian origin change makers whose work moves across geographies, bridging their global learnings with local reality, and whose philanthropy is reshaping how we think about leadership and long-term social investment. For this episode, we ask a question that sits at the heart of every serious philanthropic endeavor. What does it mean to lead? To give, yes, but also to shape the culture, priorities, and staying power of institutions we support. My guest for this episode has spent his career studying organizations, what makes them sick, what makes them endure, and what works and what doesn't work. As a senior partner at McKinsey Company, his extensive experience stretches across a broad range of organizational change-related subjects in a variety of industries, including high-tech, healthcare, and industrial companies. What stands out, however, is how consistently he demonstrates his expertise in designing and implementing leadership, performance management, and capability building, not just with client servicing, but also internally at McKinsey. The work that I want to talk to him about in this episode is built from the same cloth, but requires a whole new approach. He serves on the boards of some of the most important organizations that sit at the front lines of educational equity in India, Akanksha, Teach for India, and Peepul. He is also a member of McKinsey's Global Social Responsibility Council. It is clear then that he does not think about leadership as a professional discipline alone. He also exercises it as a philanthropic one. Ramesh Srinivasan, welcome to Catalyzing Change and this episode of Unusual Suspects. It's a genuine pleasure to have you with us, Ramesh.
Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you for having me.
Ramesh, let's look back a bit and come back and zoom in and zoom out. You have spent over 2 decades at McKinsey, a firm that by design and also by character works with people who want to solve the largest, the most complex problems, and you do it as a day job. But they still typically see logical conclusions. There are deliverables, there are defined markers and metrics, there are timelines, there are stakeholders who are held to account. The work that you do on the boards of Akanksha, Teach for India, etc. is, however, a little different. It's unbounded, it's nuanced, there are many layers, and it also tries to address the problem of educational inequity in India. And it does not have a completion date because we are achieving new milestones and the milestones also keep on changing. I want to start there with that choice. What pulled you to this work? That by its nature, you cannot finish by definition.
Thank you, Gaurav. You're absolutely right. These problems of education inequity, health inequity, gender differences, all of these are much longer term problems. So I actually have spent 31 years at McKinsey. I spent the first 11 years in India and the last 20 years in the US. The reason I got involved was, when McKinsey started in India in the early 90s, the group of people who started McKinsey, including Tinu Puri, who unfortunately recently passed away, they all came from a family of people who were involved with service in some way, shape, or form. My own father was with the military engineering service in India, and I went to Kendriya Vidyalaya or Central School. You may have heard about it. And I got an excellent education at like really low cost. And I felt I owed it back to the system to give back. And so almost 25 years ago, when my wife Charuta and I met Shaheen Mistry, the founder of Akanksha and founder of Teach for India, immediately I could see the vision she had for improving the lives of kids, especially from less privileged backgrounds, and her passion for bringing the voices of students out in the world and leading, as she calls it, leading with love and delivering educational equity or attempting to drive it. That cause really spoke to me, and we've been involved for nearly 25 years. My wife actually, we met at business school. We've been married more than 30 years, and she decided to switch to education, in part inspired by Shaheen and Akanksha. And so we came to the US. She did 2 masters in education. She was teaching for more than a decade at a public school in Harlem, teaching math. And now she has founded her own nonprofit called Problem Solvers Lab, which is focused on critical thinking, largely in India, a little bit in the US as well. So, in a sense, what started as an obligation to give back has now become central theme of purpose for myself, my wife, our own relationship.
Absolutely. And, the contribution of public education systems like the Kendriya Vidyalayas in India is extremely commendable, particularly in trying to address the problem of education inequity through publicly funded institutions offering high quality education. So I want to continue with this thread with a slightly provocative question, if as it were. In your chosen profession, in the corporate world, you work with some of the most well resourced institutions with capital, sophisticated governance, global talent, etc. And there's a definite structure to it. And yet, a frequently recurring diagnosis is a leadership problem. When you step into the boardroom of a nonprofit, is the diagnosis any different?
A nonprofit often brings a lot of passion, purpose. The leaders in these nonprofits are very mission oriented. When I look at the leadership team at Akanksha or Teach for India or Peepul or even Circle Foundation that I've more recently gotten involved with, all of these founders and leadership teams bring a lot of passion and purpose. I think the challenge is, and you were hinting at this, how do they bring even more rigor to what they do? How do they bring a performance orientation? Saurabh Taneja, the CEO of Akanksha, often talks about passion and purpose with performance. And so I have believed, and we as McKinsey have believed, that there is a critical role for civil society to play in the world, and impact on some of these tough social problems happens when the private sector, the social sector, the public sector come together to then work in partnership to solve some of these complex problems. So Akanksha itself works in a public-private partnership mode with the government of Maharashtra to then support many schools in their development. We're also supporting some of the municipal corporations like Pimpri Chinchwad to improve education, bringing all the practices that we have as Akanksha and giving them to the system in an open source way. So I really, at the highest level, all these organizations often have inspiring missions. The relative challenges are slightly different in these social contexts versus the private context.
It's absolutely very right when you say that civil society organizations have a very critical role to play, which brings me to my next question, particularly in the context of Akanksha, Teach for India people, they all have their own models, their own culture, their own theories of change. They work on their own sets of hypotheses. Yet they're bound together by a common cause. And there's clearly a very neat common cause. How do you make sure a presence on each board is generative and brings value while also holding their complexities? Because by definition and by objective, they're also solving different problems, but they're also thread together by a common cause.
No, it's again a great question, Gaurav. You're absolutely right. Each of these institutions comes at the education equity problem with a slightly different lens. The role I play, firstly, the founders are incredibly inspiring leaders. The leadership teams have a lot of skills and experiences that they bring to these problems. The role that I play as a board member is really in, holding the mirror a little bit to them, being there in support as they go through the ups and downs of their own journeys, often connecting them with each other so that they can learn from each other. I see incredible synergies because, as you said, they're working on a common problem. And these things take time. I've been involved with Akanksha, like I said, for almost 25 years. So it's the consistency of involvement that matters. I've been spending a few hours a week for 25 years. So you learn a lot. The skill of listening is really critical. And then from that, I see myself as a facilitator, a coach, a champion, a cheerleader. And it's that process then that leads to more creative ideas, innovations that these organizations have then implemented. And I always say that what my wife Charu and I have learned and gained from this involvement over such a long period far exceeds what we have given back. And that's what keeps us going.
Ramesh, one of the persistent anxieties in the social sector is, of course, related to founder dependency. You must also see that in your work with startups and while advising organizations on succession planning, and that is something that I would assume that you encounter very often. What does that look like in the social sector, Ramesh?
I think in the social sector, the role of the founder is very critical. Very similar, like you said, to a startup environment. And at McKinsey, we and I advise both startups, but also large companies that have moved on from the original founder. And I think the founder brings incredible value in terms of setting the direction, the values, ensuring the boundary conditions for the institution are very clear. I think over time, institutions need to learn how to build succession planning in their system. So Akanksha is a case in point. At some point, Shaheen Mistry, the founder, she had the idea of starting Teach for India and decided to spend more of her time at Teach for India. So as a board, we went through a process, and of course, Shaheen was very much part of the process, but it was a board-led process to find her successor. And I'm also very proud that we went through not just one succession, but we went through a second succession. We went from Shaheen to Vandana Goyal, who now actually is at Avanti Fellows. And then from Vandana, we now have Saurabh. And so this is really the responsibility of the board. And I think founders who think about sustainability invest the time and energy in setting up such a board, setting up professional processes for governance. And that's what leads to sustainable institutions. And ultimately, I believe institutions need both. They need the inspiration, the passion, the vision of the founder. And for sustainability, they need the governance, the skills, the experiences of a board that can then support a long-term sustainable organization.
Ramesh, your corporate background values and attaches a lot of value and importance to rigor, measurement, and scalability. And the social sector's systems, however, do not necessarily fit into those frameworks because those frameworks are defined and drawn from corporate requirements. The proximity to community, trust based relationships, long term bets without guaranteed returns don't always translate into neat metrics, and the markers can be very, very different. When you began your journey with nonprofits and organizations in the social sector, what did you carry with you and what had to be left at the door?
Gaurav, one of the things that really inspired me to join and get involved with Akanksha, in fact, both my wife Charu and I, was the commitment to excellence and really making sure every student learns in the Akanksha classroom. Back in the day, it was a center model that complemented what was happening in the municipal schools. Over time, through the public-private partnership, Akanksha got involved more with these students. So that drive, commitment to excellence for every student was a critical force that drew us to the institution. And that I actually think is common when I work with other nonprofits. I look for that push for excellence, the push to do for improvement, the skill of giving and receiving and inviting feedback to improve. So those are practices that are actually common between the high performing social sector organizations and the private sector. You're absolutely right. The proximity to the community is critical. In fact, I have learned that from my work with Akanksha and Teach for India. Even our last Teach for India board meeting in Bangalore, we spent many hours at a community in Koramangala. It was incredibly illuminating to understand the challenges of migration and classic urban issues that our communities that Teach for India serves are wrestling with. And these are tough problems. They go beyond education. These communities are facing problems around gender, around healthcare issues. And that's the context in which these students are coming to the classroom. And as board members, unless we understand that, cannot have impact. I would say even in the private sector, the best boards spend time thinking about their customers, the challenge their customers are going through. P&G, great example where they expect not just the leadership team, but even the board to go spend time with the consumers and understanding the needs and the challenges of consumers. So I think that aspect is quite important. The trick of metrics and defining measurement is true, frankly, in both the social sector and the private sector. The key is to link it to excellence at the field level and what drives that, and then anchoring the scaling conversation from that excellence and figuring out creative models for how to think about that scale. And in any of these contexts, whether it's Akanksha, Peepul, or Teach for India, we always prioritize the excellence for the student, and then from that lens, the leadership teams then think about how to take that impact to more and more people. And if there's ever a trade-off, we always prioritize in favor of the student.
Ramesh, let's talk a little bit about diaspora giving, since that is, after all, what this episode's focus is. You are an Indian origin professional leading at the highest levels of a global institution, while simultaneously giving your time and expertise to organizations working on one of India's most intractable challenges, like education, addressing the problems of education inequity. What to you makes a diaspora professionals well positioned to contribute to social sector leadership in India, particularly in areas like education?
Gaurav, I actually think many of us, and like I shared my own story at the beginning, have benefited from the Indian system, whether it's the public education system or even the healthcare or other infrastructure investments that the Indian government has made. And so I feel like we have an obligation to give back. And like I said, it actually has made me a better human being and better leader. The connection with the community, reflecting on my own purpose has been very fulfilling for me. And many of the diaspora leaders, I think, have a similar orientation. They bring skills around solving tough problems. They bring skills around rigor and how to think about performance. They bring skills around scaling, could be with technology, could be beyond that. And all of these can be quite valuable. They also often have networks. They can help with fundraising. So all of these can be very valuable to contribute to these intractable social impact problems in India. And so that's why I think this is a huge opportunity. Charu and I, we are actually Indian citizens, even though we have a US green card. And for us, this commitment to India runs very deep. And as we think about our own lives, if we could have made a difference to a few students in India, that makes our own life a more purposeful, more well-lived life.
Ramesh, my last question to you is about the largest frame available to us. And let's crystal gaze into 2047, by which time we have set ourselves a target to become a developed nations. One of the takeaways from our conversation has been how leadership, when done well, is a philanthropic act in itself. So I put this to you. If India is going to get 2047 with its most vulnerable communities included in that vision, what does the leadership of its social sector institutions need to look like? And where does the diaspora fit into this structure?
I think, firstly, I'm very excited. The momentum in India and what's happening gives me a lot of hope. And yet, like you said, it's the solving these problems, creating jobs for millions of Indians coming through the education system and doing this with equity as a lens in solving India's economic development is not an easy challenge. And I think there is a critical role that the social sector, the private sector can play in partnership with the public sector. And I think it comes down to leadership. And I think these leaders, especially in civil society, in the social sector, need to come with perspective, a long-term perspective on how to solve these problems. I often counsel these leaders to say it's a marathon, not a sprint. And they need to take care of themselves as they're solving these problems. And they need to use this perspective to understand how different stakeholders can contribute and play a role of facilitative, inclusive leaders in this process, collaborate a lot more and learn from each other and learn from other stakeholders as well, to then, with this vision of excellence, with this vision of continuous improvement, learning from each other. I recently wrote a book on leadership called The Journey of Leadership. And one of the chapters in there is this concept of fearless learning. How do I keep learning every day so that I can get better and better? And that's the spirit that these leaders need to bring. And with that, I think hopefully every stakeholder they serve, every day they're spending in the community can make a small difference. And together, collectively, they and we can make a better India for 2047.
Note to end this conversation with Ramesh Srinivasan. Thank you so much for taking the time out and dropping by to have this conversation with us and sharing your deep insights and perspectives on a range of issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gaurav.